As I said before, to those who signed on a little early, my name's Heba Gowayed. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in materials chemistry. I specialize in shooting lasers to make crystals, but that's not here or there. I'm also the co-chair of March for Science New York City. Thank you for coming to our Get Out the Vote panel series, in which we're going to talk about various issues that have to do with the American electoral process, such as climate change, immigration, science policy itself, and there are plenty more panels that are filled with experts and community activists, so you can get both the expert advice of what's happening as well as what is happening on the ground, so that way you can get more involved. This is funded by the Science Rising Challenge that we got a grant for in order to host these, hosted by the Union of Concerned Scientists. So thank you so much to the Union of Concerned Scientists for your support and for all the work that you do. This is happening every week, so please tune in next week. In order to ask, the way this is going to be structured is that our moderator will have a conversation with our panelists, and they will introduce the topics and what they're doing. And then if you have a question at any point in the Q&A section of the Zoom, you can type in your question. That will be the only way that you can ask questions, and then the moderator will choose from those questions and answer them, for the panelists to answer them. So thank you so much. And now I'd like to hand it off to, or I'd like to introduce our panelists, sorry, excuse me. Dr. Heba Gowayed is a Boston University professor who does work on Syrian refugees and research on Syrian refugees and a comparative analysis of Syrian refugees. Dr. Lucky Tran is the co-chair of March for Science March for Science Global. He is also a science communication specialist over at Columbia. And Tony Alarcon, or Tony, he is one of the plaintiffs against Trump, and thank you. Please give a big round of applause. I know we can't hear you, but please give a big round of applause to him, because they recently won the Supreme Court case against Trump for DACA recipients, and he does work with Make the Road New York. He's a fellow there, and I'm really excited to hear from all of you about immigration and immigration justice. So please give it off to one of our own from March for Science New York City, Audrey Malone.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the intro, Omar. Again, I am Audrey Malone. I am the co-director of communications with March for Science New York City, and I'm excited to be moderating this panel with a bunch of brilliant minds whom I am looking forward to hearing from and learning more about their stances on immigration policy moving forward. We're going to kick off our discussion this evening. We're going to start with the history and state of policy discussion. We're going to kick this off with Dr. Heba. Please do not, hold it against me. Omar did not crash test me about how to pronounce your last name. So we're going to start it with Dr. Heba Gowayed. She's going to start this discussion tonight with the history and state of policy discussion. Heba, how are you?
Good. How are you? Thank you, Audrey.
I am great. I'm glad you didn't just give me the signal for, oh, you messed up.
No, it's okay. It's Gowayed, but it's close enough. It's close enough. My first name is really the one I'm protective of, and you pronounce that perfectly.
Great.
Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. I think I'm going to start out a little bit with telling you about my research, my work, and then positioning it within the broader policy context currently, and then sort of taking us back and thinking about how this is positioned sort of historically.
Okay.
So my research began, I study Syrian refugees comparatively, and my research began in 2015 when we saw a huge number of people who were asylum seekers go overland into Europe, over the Mediterranean Sea, fleeing the Syrian war, which, as you all know, began in 2012. And, I heard about something called a resettlement program, which was happening in the United States to resettle these refugees, to give them a home here, to invite them to come here. And this really piqued my interest in sort of what this world of asylum seeking and resettlement looked like. So to give you a sense, when a war happens, when people are persecuted en masse, typically, they can apply, they become refugees in the sense that they're internally displaced within their country of origin. And then once they cross their country, once they cross the borders of their country to seek refuge somewhere else, they become sort of displaced people or refugees in the way that we define the term, in the way that the UNHCR defines the term. And for people who are in that situation of displacement, and by the way, across the world, there are 25 million people, and that's a conservative estimate, who are currently in a situation of displacement, who are defined as people fleeing home because they need a safe haven. When people flee, there are, very limited options for what can happen or how they can find another secure place. So one is that they stay in these countries of immediate refuge, places, for instance, for the Syrians, they would be places like Jordan and Turkey, countries that abut those countries. And then they wait there and they can either make a life there, but sometimes those lives are really difficult because people are undocumented when they leave their country, they lack legal status. And the other option is that the country, the war ends or the situation of displacement ends and they can go back. That doesn't happen very often. And then another option is resettlement, which is where a government recognizes somebody as a refugee and provides them with a place to live. Now, importantly, who gets claimed as a refugee is highly political. So for instance, if you look at refugees from Haiti versus refugees from Cuba, right? People from Haiti who fled versus people from Cuba who fled, you find that there's a discrepancy there in who gets classified as a refugee, for instance, by the United States government, right? The United States government is adversarial to Cuba, therefore people who come from Cuba are fleeing a big bad oppressor and therefore are resettled refugees or are asylum seekers, whereas people from Haiti did not always get that recognition. Also, there's the issue of race, right? So people from Haiti are obviously more likely to be Black. And so what does it mean, right, to have these different identities and move across space? And we're seeing that again when we talk about asylum, for instance, in the current moment, in the way that in which Latinos have been racialized in this country, right? But moving back to my project, so I looked at resettlement in the United States. And resettlement in the United States is classified as sort of a humanitarian project, right? There are people who are given a home, invited to come to the United States. So they're processed in the country that they're in the country of immediate refuge. So for the Syrians, for instance, that would be Jordan. And they're said, you're safe, you're secure, and you can travel to the United States. We'll give you safe passage, right? So the idea behind it, and they pick really the most difficult cases. So people who have multiple children, people who have chronic health burdens. So the idea behind it is really beautiful. And people were arriving, the last year of the Obama administration, 80,000 people arrived, and it was projected that 100,000 people were going to arrive through resettlement. But my project really looked at what happens when people get here. Mm-hmm. And, began to look at sort of, okay, you have these refugees who arrive, and we typically look at, we typically study immigration just through the laws of that govern, people's legal status, etc. But I also found that when people arrive here, they end up being low income in the United States because they enter a social service system in the United States that's very, very severely depleted because it's a system, again, that's built on racial discrimination, right? It's a system that's based on the assumption that poor people are Black, and therefore the system has been slashed from the 1996 welfare reforms, etc. And so I began to sort of think about, okay, how does this look in other countries? And I began to study Germany with a stronger social service system that has a very specific notion of who is skilled and unskilled. And therefore refugees, for instance, who arrive there, who might be skilled professionals, have to re-credentialize through the German system. And then I looked at Canada, which provides some level of assistance, probably stronger assistance, definitely stronger assistance in the United States, but also has sort of a neoliberal approach to how that assistance is offered, right? And then when you begin to look at those countries, and you begin to do a comparative study, you begin to see that different countries sort of see human potential differently. And so when you have an immigrant who arrives in a country, it's important then to look at two things. One thing to look at is what kinds of laws are in place that allow people to arrive and have legal status once they're here. And the second is how are people treated once they're in the country. And this becomes very important when we think about the current moment and the current administration, right? So we have this moment of heightened xenophobia, heightened racism, heightened anti-immigrant sentiment, heightened white supremacy. Really is what we're going to call it. And the issue becomes, right, on the side of legality, the issue becomes is who is allowed to enter. So the resettlement program that I just described to you as a humanitarian program has been slashed. So this year, the number projected is less than 18,000 people to arrive through this program, where the United States has sort of led the world for the better part of the last century. But we're also seeing this kind of, xenophobia on multiple fronts, right? So for instance, just last week we dealt with the ICE student ban. And I wrote an open letter that actually got 30,000 signatures against the ICE student ban, and they decided to withdraw it. But, the F1 visa issue has always been an issue. in terms of who's allowed to be here. And I think that Tony might talk about this a little more, but then there's a question of sort of, once you're here, whether you can fall in and out of status, right? The question of legal liminality. And why our country, for instance, doesn't offer amnesty to people who are sort of at that border, or why we don't have more robust legislation that allows people to sort of claim legal status or persist in legal status, right? Why we have these kinds of ice bans that happen. But the other thing that I want to mention is that, in putting this now in historical context, is that this white supremacy around laws is not new. So, you know, I hear a lot of rhetoric, particularly, for instance, about the student ban last week or around DACA, which, you know, people like to say, well, we're going to see what's going to happen, or even around the refugee issue, which is the issue that I work on more closely. We're going to see what happens in November, right? We're going to see what, you know, with the change of administration, these problems will be fixed. And I think that a lot of them will be, because, you know, there is this amplification, this very xenophobic moment, this very white supremacist moment. But a lot of these problems are not new, right? We have an immigration system that is built around white supremacy in a very real way. So let me give you an example. Trump got up earlier this week and talked about merit-based immigration, that he wants merit-based immigration. The reason why we don't have merit-based, you know, and it's a very neoliberal conceptualization, and it'll be done in a very, very racist way. And I'm not, you know, a proponent of capitalism, so I'm not defending this idea of merit-based immigration. But the reason why we don't have it is actually that the 1965 Immigration Act made it so that we had family-based reunification, because the numbers of immigrants who had been allowed to arrive, you know, over the course of the century prior, who were people of color, was limited. Because what we had is a 1924 law that restricted anybody that selected, that said, you know, who we want to arrive in the United States are people who are Western European, right? So we want the Brits, we want, and we don't want, you know, the Asians were excluded. Anybody else, even Eastern Europeans, were seen as not white enough, right? Not assimilable enough. And particularly Jews were particularly, like, explicitly excluded, right? And so you have this situation where, because all of these people had been prevented from coming for such a long time, that in 1965, they thought, okay, the way that we can keep America white is by making it family reunification. Because the people who are here are going to bring their families, and they're going to be white, and their families are going to be white, so we're going to be able to keep America white. What they didn't bet on was the fact that those people didn't need to immigrate. They were happy where they were in Europe, because Europe at that point was stable. It was, you know, the people who hadn't been allowed to travel, whose countries had been ravaged by, like, post-colonial policies and colonialism, etc., and by, you know, all these inequalities in the world that we see, who felt like they needed to immigrate. And that's where we get, you know, so it kind of backfired on them, and family reunification became used in a different way. But the point that I want to make is that, you know, these policies and these systems at their very core, at their very base, are really based on white supremacy. And what we need to make sure that we do is that, regardless of who wins in November, we need to keep fighting for justice on immigration fronts, because this is not something that, you know, is a Trump issue, right? This is something that is a longer and more historical issue in the United States. And with that, let me turn it back to Audrey, who I think
you are very passionate about it. I love it. Like, you bring up a very strong point, because I remember conversations between Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. Well, I won't say conversations, I will say debates and arguments, because it is historically known that those two went head to head. But in their era, like, there was this really big issue about how should I say it? Not foreign Africans coming in from the Caribbean and from the British, and there was this gain that existed with their immigration status, and the fact that when they got to the U.S., they were able to, I use the term loosely, they were able to catapult themselves above the African Americans that were here in the United States, and there created this rift. And Marcus Garvey was like, well, you know, we understand that this exists, but maybe if you did this, and W.E.B. Du Bois was like, no, you don't belong here, you gotta go. And there's always been this rift when it came to immigration. And within that time, the U.S. was like, okay, you know what? There's only a certain amount of foreign Africans that can come from the Caribbean or from Africa or from British. And that kind of, like, all the West Indians who immigrated here, they were kind of locked. Their families were still in the Caribbean, and they were here trying to figure out, okay, so how do we reunite? So when reunification came about, it was like, okay, all our families can come together. So I can see where that influx happened, and how that timeline was created. And it's like, oh, well, we thought we were going to get this kind, but we ended up getting this kind. And I think that's where we have this really big rift when it comes to immigration and how people understand immigration and how it works for Americans altogether, because everybody thinks of immigration as it's this hot button topic. It's this black hole. It's this thing that we need to fix so we can get rid of people who aren't American and who aren't white and who are breaking down the system, when our country only works better if we have immigrants. Like at the end of the day, it only works better if we have immigrants. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because you said so many things that bring up so many important points. Like you said, there was a decline from 80,000 to the estimated 100,000 to only like 18,000 coming in for the resettlement program. So now the question is being begged, what is happening that the numbers have dwindled so low so quickly?
Oh, he's cut them. So the thing is that it's a very purposeful cut. So there was a whole conversation like, should they be Christian refugees, right? Should they be this? Should be, and actually the people who are coming tend to be SIVs. SIVs come on a special immigrant visa, and the special immigrant visas are people who are supporting the U.S. military abroad. So it's become this, it's really, there's a real question as to what happens, what is happening to the resettlement program. And the real question too is that now I'm doing interviews across the United States with resettlement agencies, and they've fired staff. Offices have closed across the country. And so now, say next year, the United States begins resettling begins resettling refugees again. Where are those people going to go? You lack the infrastructure. But it's very interesting that you bring Du Bois, and it's very interesting that you bring up this relationship, this issue of race and origin, because I think it's a super fascinating topic. So Du Bois was somebody who recognized that, internationally, people, he recognized sort of the U.S. imperial project when it came to race. And I consider him one of, the founder of sociology. And he was very clear on the fact that, he used the language of that we're sort of all seen as minorities, or all seen as sort of, subordinate to white people in different ways across the world, because he was somebody who would travel and he was somebody who saw this. But what's really interesting is that when immigrants come here, there is a lot of anti-Black racism, right? There's a lot of anti-African-American racism. And even among Black immigrants, there's a really interesting book by Mary Waters I think it's called Black Identities. And she writes about, what happens when people from the West Indies come to the United States and they're Black, but they are like, yeah, we're Black, but we're not African-American, right?
Yeah, and that's a really big thing.
Or you see this in the Latinx community, right? People who are saying, I'm not Black, right? When they, when they present Black, or when they, when their heritage is Black, right? So like we see a lot of anti-Blackness among people of color and among Black people even. And it's a very interesting thing, but it's like, that's how pervasive and hostile and, and damaging the concept of white supremacy is that it sits within us all in these really sinister ways. And it's really fascinating to watch, with the refugees, with the resettled refugees, particularly the Syrian refugees, to watch them recognize what it means to be racialized in the United States, and what it means for them to not be, how they learn that they're not white. And then once you learn you're not white, okay, you learn what that means. You learn that people have stereotypes about you because you're not white. Okay, so who do you ally with, right? Mm-hmm. Are you then, once you learn you're not white, are you saying, yeah, I'm not white, but I'm not like those people over there. I'm not white, but I'm not Black? Or do you recognize I'm not white, and the Black guy at the DMV is going to be nicer to me, and the Black bus driver is going to be nicer to me, and there's going to be a relationship that I can build out, outside of because I'm not white, mm-hmm. right? That I'm going to recognize that I have similar experiences to other kinds of people. There are links to other kinds of people. And I don't think that, and it depends on, I think it takes time, and I think it takes, to break those barriers and to sort of build those bridges.
It definitely takes time, and it takes a lot of education. Like I'm West Indian. My family is from heavily in the Caribbean, and it's when I I grew up in St. Thomas, so I understood my Blackness. I knew it existed. I knew I was Black. Because we're a U.S. territory, we understood the terms African American. But when I have family and friends who are from Dominica or Antigua, Anguilla, Jamaica, and the idea of Blackness is non-existent for them, because in their minds, they're still under the Queen. Like mm-hmm. they still represent as British or independent, and the idea of being Black is still within colonial realms. When they get here, it's like, they don't know who to align to. But when anything happens, those who look like them, African Americans or Africans, anybody from the diaspora, that's who comes to them first. And then they have this aha moment, like, maybe my alignment is, you know, misaligned and I should change it, because what I identify as is it's being thrown to the side, or like a curve is being thrown. And it's with that, it's so interesting to understand. A lot of people don't understand what the difference is in seeking, well, I can't even say seeking asylum, but it's seeking some kind of status in the US is. Like, most people don't understand asylum. They don't understand being a refugee. And they definitely don't understand the term migrant and immigrant. Like, I find that a lot of people don't understand the difference between migrant and immigrant. So could you just break that down in lay terms so people can understand the exact differences between that?
In terms of?
Well, people confuse migrant and immigrant. People think migrants and immigrants are synonymous when in fact they're not. I know I know migrants are people who travel of their own will, consciously. They go forth, whether it's for work or for personal gain or just to live here.
You're saying like from a legal perspective?
Yeah, from a legal perspective.
Yes, yeah. So an immigrant, so you know, it's interesting because there are variations in status in the United States. So somebody may immigrate, right? So that's why I'm asking you to, so somebody may immigrate, but not be an immigrant in the eyes of the state in which they have arrived, meaning that they might be choosing to move from one place to another in order to establish a permanent residency in place B, but not receive an immigrant status and remain in sort of a legal liminality, meaning that they have a discretionary or temporary legal status. And yeah, and that can become a very, you know, difficult, you know, and then somebody might move, right? So like, so for me, I think that there's a question of sort of who we're seeing something from the perspective, you know, whose perspective are we looking from, right? Mm-hmm. So whose perspective are we defining, or who, you know, are we looking at the legal definitions, at which point, you know, somebody who might be a refugee is not a refugee, right? Somebody who might be an asylum seeker might not be an asylum seeker, might be, you know, as Trump likes to say, I don't know what he even says, right? Like undocumented or illegal person, right? I feel like it's a slur. I won't even use it.
Yeah, but it's a slur.
Yeah. But you know, it's sort of a question of legality, and I think that the question of legality, and I think Tony's going to talk about this a little more, but the question of legality becomes very important in the United States and how to advocate around legality.
Awesome. And I appreciate that segue, Heba, because we're going to move it right on out to Tony Alarcon. Listen, I'm tired. I'm going to be messing up everybody's names, so don't take it personally, okay? Antonio Alarcon. Anyway, so Tony is going to address the gaps in immigration policy for us, and he has a personal story involved in this and how he navigates through immigration. So Tony, if you could just bless us with your story.
Thank you, Audrey. So I guess I can start when, I don't know, how did I join the movement, maybe? I'm originally from Mexico. I migrated to the US when I was 10 years old. I didn't know why I was coming to this country. My parents went to Mexico after, let me go back to the story, I guess. My immigration story actually begins when I was probably 3 years old, 4. My parents, because of the lack of resources in my town in Mexico, they migrated to another town or another state in Mexico. And, you know, because they were closer to the border, they were like, okay, we're living to the US, right? At the time I was living with my grandparents, and that was kind of like the last time that I saw my parents for many years. And in 2005, they decided to return to Mexico. And that's when they, like, a couple of months later, they bring me to the US. Again, I didn't know why I was coming to the US. I just remember like crossing the border for like 3 days and 3 nights with other dozens of immigrants as well, right? Like on a minivan. And I knew I was coming to the US, but I didn't know why or the reasons why. So I arrived to New York, and I remember like my first year actually was super bad. I mean, I remember like just being at home for a year because my parents didn't have the knowledge of you know, like of any other parents who was here in the US. They thought that undocumented students were actually not allowed to go to school, right? So for a year, I was just at home trying to learn the language. I remember just my mom, particularly my dad, will like, find the chancla and be like, hey, you need to like speak English like within a month. And I was like, how the I'm gonna
We're gonna do that.
So it was hard, but after a year, one of my aunt shared with my mom, knowledge about how the system works, and that's how I started my education here in the U.S. I remember I got bullied by my peers because obviously they will have some knowledge of the language, and even with the professors, I think even though I live in Queens, some of the professors will be like, you will never be someone in life because X, right? Like because you don't have a status, or because you don't have a proper documentation. Another time I was like, okay, I mean, I knew I was undocumented, right? I knew because I crossed the border with my parents. I was like, I always knew about my status. But I think the moment or the point for many dreamers like myself is when we are applying for college, right? And we are asked for our social security number. And I feel like this story repeats itself like in millions of dreamers around the country, where in my junior year, I was applying for college, and I remember my guidance counselor reaching out to me. She was like, "Hey, congratulations, you got selected to go like to these private institutions." And I was like, "Okay, it's exciting, right?" And right away, she was like, "Okay, I need your social, right? That's kind of like the first step." And I was like, "I don't have a social security number." Because we're live. Friend just came in. I remember like saying that to her, and right away she was like, "Well, unfortunately, because you don't have a social, like we're not going to be able to provide the scholarship." And that's again like the reality of many dreamers. Fortunately enough, I had enough support from other mentors and professors who were like, this is not the end. You are a great student. We're gonna support you. And I was able to go to school and graduated from college and being the first one in my family. But that's not necessarily the reality for many other folks, right? So we know that I knew in 2010 when the dream had failed that I needed to do something, and that's how like I started to get involved in the movement. It wasn't because I necessarily wanted, right, but it was because more for forced to do it, because I needed to do something for my own community and for myself. So since then I've been involved in and Make the Road. So it's been like more than 10 years now, and I've been like kind of advocating for not only for immigrants but also like the interconnection between other communities, right? Like as a queer Mexican immigrant, like I need to make that we are fighting for other folks, not only like the immigrant community. Like obviously we need to fight for everyone because we are all suffering in different ways based on the system, right? Like the white supremacy that we have in this nation. So we need to ensure that we are fighting and understanding, right? Like as Heba mentioned, we need to ensure that people understand that we are all interconnected on the issues, right? It's not only like climate change is a separate issue, it's actually an immigration issue, such as many other issues that are interconnected. So I started that work in 2010, and since then I just became very vocal about immigration. And in 2016, as we all know the result, right? And the person that we have in the White House, which I never expected to have this person there, it kind of hit the reality, right? Like it's not something new, I guess, for us, right? As they mentioned before, like immigration is not a new theme. Has been there for generations. Racism has been there for like since the beginning of this country.
Fact.
So, but I think it just hit another reality, right? Like it was so explicit in our faces that we were like, oh shit, like what are we gonna do? And for dreamers, we knew that, particularly for DACA recipients, right? Like we knew that this was not gonna be a good administration for us, and even for the and he came with a clear agenda, right? Like with a clear agenda that he was going to be xenophobic and racist, and that's exactly what he did on the first few months. He put a lot of bans against many different communities, right? And then eventually he decided to take DACA away. So that's when, like, many of the dreamers who fortunately enough have DACA, right? Like, we decided to step up for the community and say, like, this is not it. This is not okay. Because if we were allowed to eliminate DACA, I think he would have even go further on his immigration policies against our communities. And I feel like putting this lawsuit, it was for us saying, like, this is not okay, right? Like, and we will fight until the end. And it hasn't been easy, trust me, because as a community organizer, I'm also, like, putting my life at risk, right? Like, I don't know what this guy is gonna do with my information. Knows, right? Like, we know that we were able to gather actually information from the courts and see reports that immigration is actually using our information against streamers. So technically, any day they can come to my house and not only deport me, but deport my aunt and my uncle, who had nothing to do with my fight, but at the end, because they live with me, I'm putting them on risk. And that's the reality that many DACA recipients have to go through every single day, you know? But we won at the court, right? And we know that as of now, we're safe. Technically, he can actually eliminate the program the right way. But we know that we're going to continue fighting. I think the biggest strength that we have and the biggest example of what leadership looks like, it's our parents. Our parents, even without having papers, they have sacrificed so much for us to be in this country. Many of them don't have, like, a college degree. They don't have the education. They don't have the language. And still they thrive on this country. And I feel like that's kind of like the motivation that many of us have to continue fighting for what is right. And as we say in the movement, right, like, I think we have learned our phones. I think for many years as dreamers, we were, like, boxing this narrative of, like, dreamers, right? Like, and what the perfect dreamer looks like. And I think we have transformed our narrative into being inclusive with our parents and understanding that a dreamer is not only ourselves, right? Or it's not the perfect 4.0 GPA student, but it's also including our parents, including the dreamer who works at the farm, right? So I think we're in a moment where we are learning our mistakes and getting into a better position where we're not only fighting for dreamers, we're fighting for our families and fighting for the 11 million undocumented immigrants that are in this country.
I like that. I noticed that you're it's very, I backtrack. Historically, I know Mexicans in their culture and the community are very collective. The family is for the family, they're for the community, they're for everyone around them, and everybody supports everybody. So with that and what you do in your organization, I know that you have a very collective and community-oriented movement. So I just want to know, how is it that you're navigating what you do and advocating for, better health care, mental health for those in your community, and how are you helping them move forward to make sure that they get what they deserve, of course, under the law?
Right. That's actually a good point to bring, particularly in the immigrant communities, right? Like for many of us, I think mental health is something that is like, has never been there, right? Like when you tell someone, like particularly Mexican, right? Like, oh, like a parent, right? Particularly, oh, let's go to see a mental health provider. They're like, well, I'm not local, right? I'm not crazy. But that's because with that culture of like not having to speak up on your problems, right? Like I'm going to like a psychologist or going to a doctor, right? And sometimes, and this is for generations, and I feel like this is something that I think as a movement we are trying to like speak up, right? And share our feelings and share our emotions. And I feel like for our parents, that's something that they never had or experienced. And I feel like it's a process, and I think we're getting there. In every space, at least in the immigrant rights movement or like the spaces that I've been part, we try to create those spaces also for our parents, because often they don't have those type of spaces, right? Like particularly in their languages. I think we have it in spaces where like white folks go, right? Or also because the price is sometimes it's very expensive, and we know that many of our family members don't have health insurance. So we're trying to provide like alternatives to doctors, right? Like healing spaces as well. But obviously we still need to educate our community members on the importance of health care and mental health as well.
And yeah, it's a very big deal in a lot of communities, especially with our older generations, because like in Mexican cultures, I don't, you're not the only cultures that hear like, I'm not crazy, I don't have to go to the doctor, I don't need to see a therapist. I still get that from my West Indian family as well. Like, that's, no, we don't have to go. Like, and it's such resistance, and it makes me feel like all the work that we do in our spaces, in our age ranges, it's like, I just want you to understand that this is for you too. Like we get a lot of pushback from our elders, and we got a lot of pushback from the state. And I know in your work, you're probably getting a lot of resistance from the state and stopping you from moving forward. But what has been a really big highlight for you outside of winning the lawsuit? What's been a really big highlight with what you're doing with your community? Like big thing in moving across immigration?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things. I feel like in New York City, in many spaces before, I was the only Mexican, right? Like I was the first Mexican in college. I was the first Mexican to be working in government. I was the first Mexican in, like, you name it. And I feel like because of the voice that I've been putting into the community, and like I don't know if I'm a troublemaker, but I just being vocal about it, right? I think many, for example, CUNY, right, like LaGuardia Community College, which is a very diverse community college, for a long time they were closed-minded about like opening scholarships for undocumented students, obviously because they have grants that they need to support the government, but I feel like you always find ways to give out to your community, right? And I feel like for a long time they were like, no, because we don't have the money. And I feel like now, after many years of like me fighting with them, now they're like, okay, now we have this amazing program for undocumented students, right? Like, and tell them to apply. And I'm just like, okay, yeah, sure. But it took like 5-6 years to get into that process, right? I feel like other thing that we are creating in our community, it's awareness of the LGBTQ community, right? For a long time, folks in our community, particularly the Latinx community, will see someone who will be a trans woman or a transgender person, right? And they will be like, oh my God, like, go away. And I feel like over the last few years, something that we have been doing a lot constantly at Make the Road is that we have a component of the LGBTQ community in the organization. And then we make sure that we also educate our parents, that we educate the elders, right? Because they need to understand that they're like the diversity in our community has been expanded beyond just female and male, right? So I feel like that I'm proud that I've been working on a lot with community members and with Make the Road to educate community folks within the Make the Road. And I feel like now they're spreading the knowledge within their own like networks and their own families, and that is okay, right, to be LGBTQ, and that is okay to spread the love with on whoever you want to. And I feel like now the younger generations, and I feel like even the parents, like it's okay for their babies to be surrounded by LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and I think that's the beauty, right? Because before it was just like, oh, I don't want my kid to be surrounded because they're like aliens or strangers, right? And I feel like that's something that has been changing in particular in this community. And I hope that the message that we're trying to send out of this community goes beyond what we have right now.
Well, I think that you will make sure that message does get shared abroad through the entire Latinx community, because one way or the other, we're all connected and we're all intersected. So we need you to keep doing the work. We need you to keep speaking up for immigrants, especially in your community, and we need you to stay with us. And with that, we're going to move our panel discussion along. If you are just joining, I know some of you are late. This is the Immigration Policy Panel for March for Science in collaboration with Science Rising Challenge. And we're going to move our panel discussion on to Lucky Tran. Lucky is the co-director of March for Science National. Thank you so much for joining us, Lucky. Lucky, you have a very interesting story as well, very detailed. You are a refugee, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I would love to give the shorthand version of my story because I hear it all the time. And maybe after that, I would like to sort of frame it by saying, So it's my personal journey as a refugee in science, and why I want to talk about why scientists should be immigration justice activists, and then highlight an area of science where it's important to bring immigrant justice activism.
I am going to let you just dazzle us however you want to dazzle us, Lucky. I am looking forward to hear the nuggets that you have to share. So.
Fantastic. So yeah, my name is Lucky. Hi, everyone. And it's actually quite interesting because it's an interesting opening whenever anyone meets me. You know, I get all sorts of things like, that's a dog's name, isn't it? Or, you know, people perceive it as a pickup line, like, are you feeling lucky today?
Oh.
I'm as lucky as anyone else, you know, but the thing about my name is it's really grounded in my history, my people's history. So my parents were from Vietnam. They were there during the war, and they were in university, and they never got to finish their university studies because the war broke out and they were put under very dangerous conditions. And so they really had to escape the country. And so they tried to do this several times, got caught and got punished for that. They made it through, fortunately, years later. And by the time they finally made it out and escaped the country, my mother was actually pregnant with me. And that was the last roll of the dice. They couldn't live there. They knew the next time they would be captured, it would be serious consequences. They jumped on a rickety boat, you know, out from Vietnam, made it across dangerous seas, and we landed in Malaysia, where I was born in a refugee camp. And I spent the first 6 months of my life there. And so my parents knew when they were there that we would be processed and moved to an English-speaking country. So they gave me an English-speaking name in tribute to their journey, which was Lucky. So, yeah. So anytime, it's really grounding because it just makes me remember the journey of all immigrants, my parents, and it really is something that is really centering for me. And so my dad was lovely because the first job that he got there was as an immigrant justice activist and a refugee rights activist. And so it's something that's always been in my blood, is doing activism around this because of my personal journey. In terms of science, as I mentioned, my parents never finished university. And so like many refugees and immigrants, I was the first one in my family to complete university. And to be honest, I went into sciences, and I always loved science from a young age, but academia just has a certain structure or a certain, you know, veneer that just made it not very accessible. And I never really truly felt like I belonged. But I made it all the way to 4th year in Australia, this is. So I made it all the way to 4th year. We have in science, a honors year, which is sort of like a master's where you're not doing classes, you're doing a research project. And I wasn't sure what to do with my future. And I remember the head of my biochemistry department at the time pulling me aside before the end of the year and saying, Lucky, I believe in you. I think refugees are amazing. And, you know, your people contribute so much to this country. And, you know, you really can do anything you set your heart on doing, you know, keep going. And, you know, and I think that little talk, it was a very simple talk, just made me feel like I believed I belonged. And I think that's something that's really important in terms of the world of academia, is that there are little things that we can always do to be more inclusive. There are, of course, big structural things as well, but the point is that you have to be aware of it. You know, that was a very intentional conversation that this person had with me, and I would not be in science today unless I was pulled to that conversation, right? And so, you know, the next week, I wasn't sure I was doing a PhD before that. He encouraged me, and I applied to Cambridge University in England. I won a scholarship, and, you know, the rest is history, I guess. And so that little talk just changed my life. And so that's my little story in science. So yeah, one thing I do want to talk about is why should scientists be activists? And I think there's been a lot of conversation over the last couple of weeks because of that ruling with the pandemic and forcing, you know, immigrant students to go to in-person classes during the pandemic, which was overturned. And I think a lot of scientists I saw advocated, a lot of universities advocated, because there is a self-interest motivation because of money for universities to do that, we should be aware of. And I think that's great. And I noticed that a lot of scientists are aware. And one line that people often say, and it happened in a lot of the marches for sciences, the signs saying Einstein was a refugee. And I think that's great. And I think that's nice. But I worry sometimes, you know, that that's the totality of immigrant advocacy that scientists do sometimes, right? And And I think particularly as an Asian person in science, who we have a lot of representation in science, and sometimes the model minority myth is pushed, I worry about, you know, having this framing of good immigrants and bad immigrants, right? And so I'm very passionate about this, is that I think it's important, it's great, it's a great narrative, and you know, stories like mine are nice to say sometimes, but it can't be the only thing that we speak about. You know, I've had so many conversations where I talk to people about immigration justice, and sometimes it'll come up, oh, but you went to Cambridge, we want people like you here, but these other people, they're going to steal our jobs. You know, it's so easy to divide. That's white supremacy for you, right? Is they try to divide and conquer. And so that's something that I'm very passionate about. And so I think we need to think about this as science advocates, is that we need to advocate for all immigration issues, whether that be Dreamers, whether that be ICE, right, anti-ICE, whether that be, you know, the border camps. All of these issues and more are important. And they really go into, you know, it's not just about having, you know, better scientists or having a pool of talent that is bigger, but say if you're working in health or biology, right? The border camps are a disgrace. They're horrible for public health, mental health, physical health. You should care about that. And, you know, if you're working as an engineer or in the tech sector or as a math person, right? ICE uses databases that, you know, to track immigrants that are built off the labor of scientists and engineers. You know, when you go to universities, you look where research is funded. Think about where your research is funded. A lot of it sometimes is, you know, ICE, right? And so we have to, you know, divest from, you know, these problematic institutions. So I think every scientist, no matter what you feel, there's an immigration justice angle that you need to look at and be aware of. And generally, you know, we should care about human rights, and we shouldn't be, you know, shy about speaking up about human rights. So I think that's an important part of framing that I'm passionate about. And the last bit that I really want to talk about is an area of science advocacy that I'm really passionate about, that I've gotten involved in, which is climate and environmental justice. And of course, that's a huge science issue because climate is a science issue. There's, you know, science denial in that, and that's all really important. But one thing that the environmental and climate movement has been really bad about is speaking about immigration and racial justice in general for years and years. And so I think this is the work that I'm trying to do with my background as both a scientist and immigrant justice as a refugee as well. And, you know, if we look, you know, at the problem, if we look at the global scale, I think it's one of the greatest moral injustices of our time. If you look at the countries who contributed least to this crisis, the least to, you know, expelling greenhouse gases, those are the countries in the global south, and those are the countries predominantly, you know, of people of color, and those are the countries that are going to suffer most because of the climate crisis. And I think that's just such a horrible travesty. We cannot be silent about this. And so there is that racial and immigration justice dynamic there. And I know that there's been several studies as well predicting, and I know Heba will probably tell us that, you know, predicting numbers of refugees is a dangerous thing, right? But just to give sort of a scale, there was a study by Norman Myers. It's sort of controversial in terms of the actual number, but because a lot of people around the world who are in these areas who will feel the impacts of the climate crisis, it may force them to move. So, you know, there's been some predictions, some say it's 200 million by 2050. There's some news sites which say 1 billion by the end of the century. And for comparison, something like those who are displaced by conflict today is around the region of 70 million, you know, and, you know, take those numbers with a grain of salt, you know, but those are relative. And so I think it's a big issue that is happening. And why are they being displaced? It's because of natural disasters, right? We saw that with Bahamas a couple of years ago.
2017?
Yes, yes. And rising seas, right, with our friends in the Pacific, that's something that they're undergoing. And, you know, all of the immigrants who are coming through Central America, and many of who are being thrown into those border camps are because of droughts and loss of livelihood because of climate change. And so all of these things are very important. And, you know, it's such a thing that we haven't talked about before, and we really need to, because there's no solving problem without getting to the roots of climate change, which, you know, isn't about, you know, balance. It is about balancing carbon budgets and all of that, but the root cause is things like white supremacy and colonialism and capitalism, right? You need to get to the roots, and these are connected. And it's the same with why there's racial injustice, and the same way there's immigration injustice. The roots are all the same. And the one last thing that I want to say about that is, despite that important framework, the environmental movement is very white. So if you look at nonprofits and movements, they're primarily led by white people and, you know, non-immigrants. In the UK, it's the second least diverse profession, according to several surveys, and it's very similar in the US. And so I think a big part of that is we're not going to get this done unless we transform our institutions, transform the leadership of these areas in science, in climate, in environmental advocacy, to center in immigrant justice and to center immigrants, refugees, and dreamers. So, yeah.
I am impassioned. Thank you, Lucky. I am, because it's funny. Like, I'm an American. Like, I was born in Philadelphia, raised in the U.S. Virgin Islands, but the conversations around immigration and colonialism and climate change have affected me since I grew up in the Virgin Islands. Because in the Caribbean archipelago, we get it from what's coming from Africa. We get what's coming from Central America. We get what's coming from South America. We get from what's coming from the rest of the Caribbean. So we're like right in the center of change. So we have to be cognizant of what happens. And all of this is just reminding me of conversations that I've been having like throughout my life, conversations about colonialism and how it affects us. And when people talk about, you know, the tropics or the Caribbean or South America or Central America, people are so romanticized, like it's gorgeous, but I'm like, there's famine, there are droughts, you know, rainforests are being burned down. There's a lot that's happening based on colonialism and institutionalized racism. And they're trying to get out of that, but nobody seems to understand that. They think immigration issues and racism is an American thing. And I'm like, no, it's global. It is global. And we have to get to a point where we can have these uncomfortably honest conversations so we can affect change. I noticed that we are dwindling on time, so I'm going to try to make these Q&As really, really quick. Lucky, I have a question for you. It might be a bit broad, but I'm going to try to trim it down. Being in science, I have always been passionate about social justice. However, something I've noticed in academia is that scientists are treated as an expert in only one discipline or in one thing. They tend to be either known as the DEI person, I don't know what that is, but I'm hoping you do, or the prominent researcher, but this person wants to be both. Can you speak to them about how they'll be able to, you know, do both?
Yeah. First, yeah, so that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? DEI. Okay. Yes, and so it's so crucial that people do that. And you're right that we're known for one thing in science. As you go along in your career, you're studying what you study is very narrow. I think the problem here is, number one, absolutely do that. It's essential. Science is not going to, you know, be productive or really, you know, one thing that we say in March for Science is science should be for the common good. Science is not going to be for the common good unless you know, center justice and equity and inclusion within science. So everyone needs to do that, and it's ridiculous that every person isn't doing that, and that question has to be asked. Having said that, I think it's problematic in the institution because you are rewarded for papers in a very specific field, and the other problem is that the burden of who does that diversity, equity, inclusion work are, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color, the people who are really harmed by the systems of repression, right? And so that's something that's embedded in academia. And often there's not a reward system. So you're not going to get promoted for that work. So you're doing this labor that is very necessary to move humanity forward, but you're not getting credit for that, and you're being held back in your profession because you're experiencing the oppression of being a person from that identity and doing the work to try to overcome it. So I think that's a long way of saying, I think we need systems in academia to completely change so that that work is acknowledged and valued and it's put forward in your career. And so that means that we also need to press upon allies to do that burden of work and push it forward and be our advocates in those rooms. And so I think that's really a key thing. And that's, you know, there's a lot that we can discuss on how to do that, but I think nothing gets changed unless we change the system.
In fact, I hope that answers our Q&A's question. There's another question, it's pretty large, so I'm going to try to break it down. I do want to ask Heba a question in terms of immigration policy. What have you seen as the most effective policy in refugee resettlement, if there is an effective policy?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. That's a great question. I think that something that we don't think about often, and that I think is an effective policy or an effective way to think about it, is that people who arrive in this country have skills, have abilities, have potential. And I really think this doesn't just have to do with refugees. I think it has to do with anybody who comes to this country to make a life in this country, whether, you know, regardless of their legal status or regardless of how they get here. And I do think that investing in people, you know, to use it sort of economic terms, providing people with support, you know, allowing people to have language, access to language, allowing people to have, you know, an ability to sort of ease into the labor market. But we also sort of just need to think more broadly about our systems, because the systems that refugees or immigrants or, you know, anybody enters are the same systems that, you know, are low income in the United States enter, right? What does it mean if your first job, you get minimum wage and you can't make a living? What does it mean if we don't have a living wage? And so I feel like all of these questions are very much interconnected, right? What does it mean to be poor in this country? What does it mean to come to this country fresh and to want to create a future, but to not have any kind of help? We have no integration support in this country. So in addition to, you know, obviously I think that there should be amnesty. I think that there should be a higher number of people resettled. I think that there, you know, I think that we should allow asylum seekers to come into this country and seek asylum. I think that, you know, we shouldn't have this, you know, long durations of people facing undocumented status and living with fear, constant fear. But I also think that something that we don't think about, and that I think is effective for resettled refugees, but is effective across the board, is how are we integrating people? How are we supporting them once they get here? Mm-hmm. And and the point that I want to stress is that, you know, obviously my heart or my interest is on the individual immigrant, right? That's what I do as an activist. But if you think about it at a national level, if you think about it just from an economic standpoint, in terms of taxes, in terms of contributions, in terms of, you know, the state infrastructure, it's an investment that reaps rewards. For instance, in the case of refugees, you know, they give back 65, I think the number was 65 billion more than that's invested in them, I think was what the study said. But, you know, immigrants are contributors. And so, you know, even from an economic standpoint, though I hate to use this economic language because I think it's problematic in, you know, other ways. But even from an economic standpoint, we see that people are, you know, that if you invest in people, if people have the language, if people have the ability, if people have the skills, then they're able to use their abilities effectively. And that we shouldn't be, you know, bringing people into this country just to push them into poverty.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that in 2019, I think about 44, like either 4 million tax returns were given with persons who did not have social security numbers. So the inference is that they were undocumented. And within that 4 million, it was like $28.6 billion in there. So it's clear that undocumented or immigrant statuses do put into our economy, but nobody wants to talk about that data or those numbers as they come in. So I am hoping that, you know, we begin to see policy that reflects merit, that reflects the humanization of the person, because these people are leaving their countries doing things. Some are scientists, some are doctors, some are tailors, some are craftsmen. They work with their hands, they're farmers, and then they get here and then it's like their way of life is completely disrupted and destroyed, and they have to start over and they don't know how. And
yeah, I mean, I think really, to put it in like just a very simple sentence, right? If we recognize each other's humanity and ability, everybody wins. Everybody wins.
Yes, everybody wins. So Antonio, I want to ask you a question specifically, because I know you mentioned that your parents went back to Mexico, and part of their returning to Mexico is what prompted you to become an activist. So how has that driven or governed what you do in your organization?
Yeah. So just let me add something into what Heba mentioned, right? I think the economical aspect, it's great, right? But also like when we think about the labor, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of labor that immigrants do that white people don't want to do, right? There has been studies where like,
you like, get no argument here.
There was an experiment of like people complaining that immigrants take their jobs, right? Like, and it was South Carolina, I think, and this white employers asked to like all these white people to go and do the jobs that these immigrants were doing, right? And out of the 10 people that actually show up to do the job, only one stayed. So I feel like we also need to acknowledge the labor contribution that many immigrants do every day, right? Like even during the COVID-19, right? We saw that, oh, they became like essential workers. Oh, wait, but like a month ago, they were you like calling them illegals and like stealing your job, and like you were not recognizing their humanity. And now, like, because pandemic is over and like people are going back to do their regular thing, right? Like now the xenophobia came back and now they're like the illegals again. So I feel like we need to acknowledge the contribution of their labor as well, besides the economical aspect. And I don't know if you can repeat me the question so I can.
Oh, no, I was asking how did your parents going back to Mexico govern or drive what you do in your organization and how you drive your community?
Yeah, so when my parents were here, they were super afraid of me sharing my status. And I feel like after my parents left, I kind of like got that relief of like me saying like, you know, there's nothing at risk. Like my parents are done. I'm not putting them on risk anymore. So I feel like that sparked for me to do the work that I do today. And obviously I think just realizing like, you know, like all the sacrifices that my parents did for this country, and like after 12 years and not able to like, you know, even though they were like good citizens, right? Like as people will call it, and going back to the bad immigrant narrative, which I hate. But like, you know, like following the rules that whatever they had to do in this country. My mom never saw like a doctor, right? Like my mom never got like health insurance, even though she will get sick. She was forced to go to work. My dad, like his dream was to get a good job, a decent job, right? But he never got one, even though he was doing everything that he was taught to do in this country. Also, he never got health insurance. He was always like, both of them were always with the hope of like, you know, one day we will be able to bring your brother to the U.S., have health insurance, have a good job, and have papers to be able to travel back and forward. That never happened, and I feel like those were like kind of the stories that I hear from other immigrants that kind of inspired me to do the work, right? And I think I mentioned before, when I came to this country, my parents didn't know the language, they didn't know the culture of the U.S., and I feel like that also like put me a lot of like pressure, well not pressure, but like commitment to do the work that I do today, because I didn't want the same stories or the same struggle that my parents went through with me. With other students, right? And I feel like that also like pushed me to help undocumented students not only to go to school, but also like, you know, achieve their dreams, not only for themselves, but I think at the end of the day, many of these dreams are for our parents, and I feel like that's kind of like the reward that many of us do for the sacrifices that our parents do for us.
All right, so 2 more questions. This one is actually for you, Antonio. How can we best support undocumented immigrants or migrants at this time who are not getting any kind of assistance from the U.S. government?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at Make the Road, we have a fund that we have been able to provide folks with some sort of relief, right? Like as we all know, like all of the undocumented community, what's excluded from the bill in Washington, D.C. So unfortunately, they're not getting the $1,200 that many folks received months ago, right? Which is still is not enough for the entire community.
Exactly.
So we've been raising funds to help them. Also, there's a lot of pantries that you can donate funds, and many of these pantries are full of undocumented folks. That's the reality, right? Like, or low income, just people, low income in general. Like, when we see those pantries, like usually are POC, right? And I feel like if you're not in New York, you can find your local nonprofit organizations that are doing an amazing and tremendous job to help not only immigrants, but I feel like just people in general do that. The system is failing on them, right? We have a president that doesn't give a F about anything or anyone. And I feel like nonprofits have been doing the work for many years, and I feel particularly now they've been doing even the double, triple amount of work because we have a system that is failing on us.
All right, well, thank you. Now, our last question, I saved this one for last. This is from Steven Scheichel. It's a compounded question. And he asks some questions that they're not rhetorical, but they're very hyperbolic. So he asks, and I'm going to try to do justice to this. Can you imagine a future where there are no more country borders? A world where everybody is living as citizens of Earth? To all our panelists, best guesses do you think there's a realistic time frame for that to happen? What would we need to happen for that to occur? And would that solve our immigration issues? And of course, to your knowledge, what international organizations are working on global immigration policies that I guess everyone can be a part of? So, don't everybody go at once, but everybody give me a little bit. Whenever you're ready, I can hum the Jeopardy theme song.
Sure, I'll start. Why not?
Okay.
I'll take one for the team. I think that we do, the way we police our borders and the way in which, borders are protected and policed is really a product of sort of modern inequality and modern regimes of inequality, right? It's the product of sort of, colonial histories. It's the product of sort of protecting or attempting to protect nations against others that they have disenfranchised. And we can see that, earlier when I was talking about, so borders, we need to think about sort of in a global sense, right? So earlier when I was talking about like who is recognized as a refugee, that's an allowance for one person to enter a border and another person to not enter a border. So given that we have this nation state system, given that we have these kinds of sets of borders, we really need to sort of have a conversation. I unfortunately cannot answer Stephen's question about when the end of borders are. I would like to be able to imagine a future in which there aren't borders, but it would mean that there would be a future where there isn't this kind of, global inequality, right? When we talk about countries that have caused, displacement, when people leave their countries, when people leave their countries to become undocumented in a place like the United States, which is harsh, right? You have to imagine what would compel somebody to do that, right? And so, and what are the historical consequences that made that discrepancy between those countries that would compel somebody to make a decision like that? And so, we have to have a serious conversation about those kinds of inequalities. And those inequalities, the ways in which our country treats other countries, the ways in which, that exploitation happened, those are currents that I feel like we need to work on changing. And then, even if the border question seems kind of far or seems kind of, something that we can't attain or something that we can't wrap our minds around and really talk about in a concrete way. But we do need to think about sort of how are we treating people who are within this country? How are we treating our neighbors? How are we as universities, as institutions? I'm an academic. How are we when Tony comes to me and says, I would like to attend and I would like to sit in your classroom. How am I responding to him? So, the question of borders is really, it's a theoretical question, but what about the borders in our classrooms, right? What about the borders in our minds? What about the borders that really govern our day-to-day? And I think there are concrete ways, and I think we've talked here about concrete ways in which we can sort of take down those borders or fight those borders that continue to go up, right? These aren't past, they're constants in their presence and their dynamic. And I do think we need to talk about sort of how we're treating people within our own communities, and the borders that are here. So that's how I would answer that.
Okay. I know, right? Just not around.
How can you follow that?
You can try. It was a multi-part question. I mean, you could try to follow what she asked, or you could answer the question: can you imagine a world without borders?
Right. I hope that one day we get to a world where like people treat each other with love and respect. I think we don't have that at this moment. And I think what Heba mentioned, right? Like there's certain things that we can control, right? There's certain things that we can. And unfortunately right now we can control like the policies, right? Because again, we have a white system. And I feel like for me, at least as a Mexican, right? Like when I talk about immigration, like I know that I can control I cannot control the policy, but I can be vocal about it. And like for me as Mexicans, like I think the hardest thing is to see that I'm like fighting for a fair immigration system in the US, but then I see my own country closing the borders to the immigrants that are coming from Central America and the way they treat those immigrants, right? So for me, it's like, how can I be an activist or an organizer when on this country when my own country is doing shit to other immigrants, right? So I feel like I didn't buckle about it because I know that if I'm fighting for something that I know it's right, I also need to make sure that I'm fighting on my own country. I mean, even though I'm not there, I'm vocal on my social media. I'm vocal against the president because I know that we have to, because I know that that's the only way that I think I can create a change in my own communities. And I feel like I have people who admire me, I guess, in a way, and also feel that, you know, putting pressure on that end of the border is also needed. So I feel like I do believe that we will get to at some point, right? And I hope in the history where everyone can just travel free as we used to do before, right? There was no borders before. There was not people that will divide us. I feel like until we separate, until we get rid of politics and religion and many other institutions that divide us, I think we will get into a place where we can love each other and protect each other.
All right, thank you, Antonio. We're going to begin to wrap up. Lucky, do you have anything that you'd like to add before we begin wrapping up?
Yeah, just quickly, I thought those were two amazing answers, so I don't have too much more to add to that. I do want to highlight that it is an opposition tactic to sort of say, oh, can you imagine a world without borders? It's like, can you imagine defunding the police, or can you imagine abolishing ICE? And I think that's the wrong framework, right? They try to create political poison pills where, oh, this candidate can't run because they believe in this. And I think we just have to turn the narrative and change that. And you know, what these two both said was really make it human-centered, right? What's wrong with talking about human rights, right? How can we get to the world that we want to build, right? Another world is possible, right? How can we imagine that? Can't we work together to build that? And so I think it's very important to push against like these little traps that, you know, different opposition groups set, and just be, you know, the people who are messaging, you know, is up there high and inspirational and something that we're bringing people together, not dividing them. So I feel strongly that we have to control the narrative there.
Yes. Well, thank you guys so much for being part of our panel on immigration policy. That this was an amazing conversation. To close out, I want to invite back our co-director at March for Science NYC, Omar, so he can close us out this evening. Hey, Omar, welcome back.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you so much, Audrey. You're an amazing moderator as always. Blew us away. Thank you so much to Heba and Tony and Lucky. Seriously, amazing panel. You brought in all the March for Science elements of connecting immigration to climate change to labor to human rights. Like that is really the.
I want to say very quickly, Lucky did an amazing job of explaining our March for Science NYC STEM the vote. Like he just led into it, explained it in detail. I'm like, that's how you do it. That's how you do it.
It's the beauty of having a national director as one of your panelists.
Amazing.
So thank you so much, everybody, for coming out. Thank you again for attending this panel. I'm going to post a link to our next event. It's actually tomorrow. It's a different one of our series, our fireside chats. There were conversations about promoting each other within STEM and talking to each other and creating spaces for us to promote each other and to advocate for one another. It's a conversation tomorrow by one of the PhD candidates at NYU Chemistry, Cicely, who's going to talk about creating Black spaces, Black academics in STEM, and creating BIPOC spaces in STEM, and the importance of that. And so please, if you can, please attend. It would be lovely to have you there. And thank you again to all our speakers. This is part of our ongoing panel discussions. We do believe in giving you evidence-based policy connected with not only experts in the field, but also the experts on the ground, the people who are doing the work day in, day out. So it's important to balance it all out. It's important for you to have the information because you know that it doesn't end at the voting booth. You know, some people don't have access to the voting booth, and it doesn't end there. It doesn't start there. Thank you, Tony. You know, your actions have to be day in, day out. Tony will send us some links for where you can send funds to if you'd like to help out. And hopefully Lucky and Heba will also send us some links and some more information. And we will send this all out to you so that way you can be prepared. Our motto is educate to empower, and hopefully we've educated you, empowered you to take action. Thank you so much and have a great day.